This is the ultimate multi-class build video. Every single one of my multi-class builds in one video. I've corrected some errors from the original videos and added a gruesome tip from one of you guys in the comments. It's all here just for you. Let's go. So this Monken Monster build is our first build. Now this incorporates 3 classes that essentially all focus on giving the Monk class more actions and bonus actions they can do each turn, as their Way of Open Hand and Flurry of Blows attacks already allow them to attack multiple times. And then we're combining this with the Fighter level 2 to grab Action Surge, which you get at level 2. And then on top of that, we're getting the Rogue level 3 at Thief as the subclass, which will then allow you to grab the bonus action you get from the Thief subclass. So ultimately, the way this build comes together is you're probably going to start as the Fighter because it gives you the most amount of proficiencies. Like say, you know, if you wanted to go into heavy armor or have a shield equipped in your offhand, which you can actually do and still use unharmed attacks to give you a little bit more AC. And then we're getting the Monk to level 6. So at level 3 here as the Monk, you will grab the Way of Open Hand subclass, as that gives you the Flurry of Blows benefits. The reason you're getting it to level 6 here is at level 6 you get the passive bonuses that allow you to add additional damage to your unarmed attacks, like say Manifestation of Soul to add additional radiant damage. So they are benefits from that. You also get the feat at level 4, which we'll talk about feats in a little bit. And then the Rogue, we are getting up to level 4 as well for that additional feat. So you get 2 feats, but at level 3, you'll pick the Thief for the extra bonus action here. Now the Thief also gives you access to those cunning actions you can use. So you could say hide or disengage or dash. The dash does come in handy for this build, so it allows you to use that bonus action to get in closer rather than having to waste an action or something like that. The ability points for this build are a little different than you may think. We are heavily focusing on strength, constitution, and a little bit of wisdom, as wisdom can be used to add to your armor class if you're not wearing armor for this sort of monk general build setup, which you probably will want to do depending on if you're equipping a shield or what your sort of general gear setup is. And for your feats, you want to grab the ability point modifier to give it 2 additional ability points to your strength, and also grab Tavern Brawler. So when you make an unarmed attack or use an improvised weapon or throw something, your strength modifier is added twice to the damage and attack rolls. And you can also get an additional strength or constitution from this as well. So essentially what this means is, because essentially all of our attacks as this monk boot are going to be unarmed, you're adding your strength modifier twice to that overall attack roll, giving you significantly more damage. So realistically, any time that you can do this is obviously significantly more beneficial than if you can't. In combat, your combat turns really just come down to using, say, your standard attacks twice, which will give you those 2 attacks. And then you've got 2 bonus actions that you can use for, say, the bonus action attacks that we're using for the Flurry of Blows, whether that be to stun enemies or topple them over or push them or whatever choice you want to make there. And then you've also got Action Surge, which you can use to then give yourself another action to make additional attacks with your standard attacks. And then on top of that, if you say have a haste potion, you can then give yourself an additional action in a different way to then attack even more. And even though when haste runs out, you do get the lethargic debuff, for the most part, by the time it runs out, unless you're doing it in say a boss fight or something, that encounter will be over because of the sheer amount of attacks you can do, especially if you're using these other 2 builds as well that we're about to talk about. And the next one is the Pactadin. So this is a Paladin and Warlock hybrid. And one of the best things about the Paladin class is the Divine Smite and the amount of sheer damage that Divine Smite can do. Now this build is a little bit different in that we are going to use a specific sword, though you don't have to, and I'll explain why we're using that specific sword in a little bit. So as a Paladin here, you get the extra attack at level 5. So essentially how this works is you have your standard attack that you can do every turn, and once you've done that attack, you've then got an extra attack from the Paladin level 5, and then after you've done that attack, you've got the extra attack from Deepen Pact, so you can essentially attack 3 times with just your basic action. But we're still combining these because I'm focusing on a specific sword that adds an additional reaction, and that sword itself also allows you to make an additional attack with the Dueler's Enthusiasm when you don't have something equipped in your second hand. Plus the Withering Cut bonus on this sword also allows you to add necrotic damage, and so you can do a lot of benefits there. But the main thing is the additional reaction. So because even without the additional Deepen Pact extra attack, right, we're going to at least attack twice. Now, this sword that we're using here, when we've got nothing in our offhand, gives you the additional option to crit if you roll a 19, and you've got those two reactions, that you can use as well. Now, because of the way that the Paladin works, you've got a pretty high chance of hitting in general, and by having the extra 19 and 20 rolls, you have got a higher chance of rolling a crit, and by changing your reactions to set up with Divine Smite, you can set it up in your reactions so that if you do critical hit, you have the option to add Divine Smite onto that attack. Now, because we have 2 reactions and 2 attacks, you can actually do this twice in one turn and just deal a ridiculous amount of damage. But you've also got a special ring you can get in Act 2, I believe, called Killer's Sweetheart. So when you actually take out an enemy like kill a creature, your next attack will be an automatic critical hit. So on top of that, you're guaranteed to then have that Divine Smite critical hit for that anyway. And even regardless of if you're not using the Divine Smite in that way, just using it normally, you've also just going to attack at least 3 times per turn just with your normal attacks plus that Jeweler's Enthusiasm with this sword. This sword does come from sort of midway through Act 3 if you do want to grab this sword, but this build itself works completely without it, right? Like, because of the way that the Warlock and the Paladin combine together, we're getting both of these to level 6. You've got all of that charisma buff that you can get, plus you're putting a lot of points into strength as well for your overall damage output. And then if you want to do some range damage, because we're a Warlock, you've got Eldritch Blast, which can be completely maxed out on top of that. So this alleviates some of the Paladin's like lesser abilities, which is in terms of like range damage, because you've got Eldritch Blast and some of the Warlock spells on top of that. You can even use the Warlock spell slots for your Divine Smite. It's a really fun and flexible build that has a lot of roleplay elements because of the Paladin as well. Highly recommend this build. Our last build that we have for today is the Gloom Assassin, and I couldn't think of a better name for this, so we're just going to go for that name. And what this build is it's combining the Rogue and the Ranger, 2 of the weakest classes in the game in my personal opinion. You can check my classes ranked video if you want more thoughts on that, but by combining these classes, we can essentially grab the best elements of each and then combine them into this amazing stealth-focused assassin class. So what you want to focus on here is initially starting as a Ranger, and we will get the Ranger to level 8 for the 2 feats, but at level 3, you'll grab the Gloom Stalker subclass to grab Dread Ambusher, so you gain a bonus to your initiative, and on the first turn of combat, your movement speed increases by 3, and you can make an attack that deals an additional 1d8 damage. Once you've got the Ranger to level 4 and you can grab a feat, I would be grabbing Sharpshooter here because you can then add additional damage to your overall attacks at the minus of the attack roll, but that doesn't really matter because most of the time we're probably going to either be attacking from stealth or attacking out of combat or from high ground, so you're going to be just getting essentially 10 free damage on every one of those attacks. Now, after you've got that, you want to add the Rogue to this build, and at level 3, we're going to pick the Assassin subclass. So this gives you a couple of bonuses, one being the Initiative Assassinate. So in combat, you have advantage on attack rolls against creatures that haven't taken their turn yet, so it just completely mitigates the Sharpshooter negatives we were just talking about. You also get Ambush, so after a successful attack roll against a surprised creature is a critical hit, so your first attack in combat or outside of combat will be a critical hit. And then the last class feature gives you your action and bonus action back at the start of combat. So the main thing you want to do here is start combat from the Rogue outside of combat, say surprising the target with like a sneak attack, and then you'll immediately get that action and bonus action back, and you can then attack again, plus you've got Dread Ambusher attack, so you'll get heaps of attacks in that one turn. And we're using this as a ranged build, and it does help alleviate those issues with the Rogue has with only being able to attack once per turn, because at level 5 with the Ranger, you'll get that extra attack, so you'll be able to shoot off 2 arrows in that one turn, regardless of whether you're in the middle of combat. But this build just absolutely excels at the start of a combat encounter, and you really want to start combat as this Gloom Assassin outside of combat and surprising those targets to get all of those benefits and deal like just heaps of damage right at the start of the turn. Like in this encounter here, you can see that I wipe out like 3 enemies before they even attack back. So this is a great build, and in terms of your ability points, we're really focusing on Dex here and a little bit of con. You could get a little bit of wisdom here because you've got a Ranger and you've got some of those spell slots available to you if you wanted to use those spells in that way. But for the most part, we're really just focusing on martial damage here with the bow and the different benefits you get. Plus, there's heaps of great gear in the game that benefits from, say, attacking from stealth and those sort of scenarios. We're going to start off with the Storm Warden first. Now, if you like to get wet, then maybe you also like lightning. Wow. Maybe not, I don't know. But if you wet a target, target and then deal lightning damage to it, it will deal double lightning damage. Now, there are two classes that combine perfectly into this like wet storm warden lightning theme class that just blends so well together. So essentially the focus here is on the Sorcerer and the Tempest Cleric, and you'll be using the Sorcerer's meta magic to cast 2 spells in one turn, or one if you've already wet the ground, but you'll use it initially first to cast water on the ground, and then you'll use a lightning spell to ignite that water and electrocute it, but also deal double damage to anyone standing in it. And then you can combine this with things like Destructive Wrath to make sure you always deal maximum damage, or even any of the reactions you get from the Sorcerer. So you can just deal an insane amount of damage with this build, just focusing on Sorcerer and the Tempest Cleric, which we are using here, but also that lightning damage. So to put this build together, you're really starting off as the Sorcerer. You can start off if it's the Cleric if you want those extra proficiencies, but essentially you want the first couple of levels of the Sorcerer to get that meta magic and grab things like Careful Spell and Quicken Spell and those benefits there. And then we're really just grabbing 2 levels of the Tempest Cleric. Now, the main reason that we're only grabbing 2 is because then you get Destructive Wrath. So when you roll Thunder or Lightning damage, you can use your Channel Divinity to deal maximum damage instead. So essentially what that means is, you know how you look at every attack and it says it's going to do, 8 to 20 damage, whatever, you use that Channel Divinity and it just will deal maximum damage. You combine that with a wet target, it's going to absolutely shred enemies because it's going to deal double damage on top of that maximum damage. So it's really beneficial, and I've decided to go with the Storm Sorcerer here as it just kind of fits this build, but you can go, say, the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer to get a little bit of extra damage around that route. As you're sort of leveling up here, you will be putting most of your points into Sorcerer and grabbing really any of the lightning spells here and anything else that you want to pick up. For your feats, I would be grabbing Ability Improvement to make sure your Charisma is maxed out for your overall damage. I'd also grab the Elemental Adept for lightning, so your spells cast ignore resistances to lightning damage. So, if something is, say, resistant to lightning damage, they no longer are, so they're still going to get that amazing amount of damage from your lightning spells, which is going to be your main focus here. And you can't roll a 1 on any lightning damage, so you always just deal that little bit extra. Now, as you level out your Sorcerer as well, you'll gain those additional benefits like the Wrath of the Storm and everything else. And when you're looking at sort of spells and stuff to pick up, but really like the benefit for this build is it's very easy to come together and it doesn't require a whole lot of gear in order to succeed. Luckily though, there is some really solid gear that you can combine this with. Some of that early to mid game like lightning charge gear you get in sort of Act 1, Act 2 that adds lightning charges you can use. So when you have a lightning charge, you will deal additional lightning damage, and once you gain 5 charges, they can be consumed to deal additional, even more lightning damage. So there's benefits there as well if you wanted to combo it with some gear, but for the most part, the build succeeds without it, right? You just need to throw some water on someone and then spray them with lightning and it will just destroy them. There isn't much else to say here. And then you can sort of tinker with, say, maybe a little bit of a dip into Wizard if you want to get a little bit more spells or a little bit more flair, but I just don't think it's needed, right? You really just need to use that meta magic to quicken a spell, cast some water on the ground, and then just spam lightning spells at them, and that's it. Like, that's the whole build. All right, on to the next one. Raging Bear is a Barbarian and Moon Druid combo. Now, I really wanted to do something with Karlach and the Barbarian in general, as Barbarians aren't particularly great at multi-classing. I've said that in a couple of videos, but obviously you can just go like the classic fighter and get action surge and that sort of a thing, and it's like, yeah, that's cool and all, but it's kind of boring. But I wanted to do something a little unique, and this is an interesting way to keep with, say, the theme of one of the Barbarian subclasses, but then also make the Moon Druid just a tiny little bit better. So essentially what we're doing here is we're grabbing mostly Druid because we're going Moon Druid to really get into that combat wild shape aspects. Now, a downside of combat wild shape is that you lose essentially like everything that you're, say, equipping and all that sort of like benefits when you are wild shaped. One thing that doesn't get rid of though is any of, say, your rage benefits. Now, a downside to the Barbarian is that you can't use any spells when you have raged, and it's the same thing really with a Moon Druid when you have wild shape. So these combo well together. So say if you wanted to use spells, then you don't have rage or wild shape active, and out of combat spells, that sort of thing you can use. But in combat, what you can do is you can rage and then wild shape, and your rage buff will actually last through your wild shape. And what we're doing here as a way to combine this is we're using the Bear Heart Rage, which will give you a buff to your resistances and essentially make you resistant to all types of damage except psychic. So then when you've got that active, and then you wild shape into another form, your wild shape's going to last significantly longer. And if you go to something, say like a bear, you can goat targets into attacking you, which will then obviously do less damage. But then you can even use other things, right? Like say, the owlbear or any of the other wild shape forms. The benefit to this on top of that though, is something that you can do is combine this with the Tavern Brawler feat. So essentially what that does is when you make an unarmed attack, you can add your strength to that attack twice. Now, when you're wild shaped, those attacks are unarmed attacks. So you will actually get that strength modifier being added twice. So the one thing to consider here is when you're wild shaping, you want to make sure you wild shape into a creature that has a high amount of strength. The owlbear is great as it has 20 strength. So that means an extra 5 for those attack rolls. So essentially the way the combat encounter goes here is at the start of the encounter, you will rage, you'll get those benefits from your bear heart. And then on that next turn, you'll use that combat wild shape. You have to start combat in your human form because you want to get that rage off. The downside to that is that you kind of waste that first turn. This build needs that first turn to get going. But once you've got that and you've actually switched forms, you are going to see a huge amount of success in that wild shape form. And it just gives you a little bit more benefits to wild shaping. One of the downsides of the Druid is that they just aren't great, especially the wild shape druids. They're just better options, and this gives you a little bit more juice to that sort of a form. But I think it also combos well with this sort of a setup, as you can then switch into those forms, and you've got sort of Barbarian that you can fall back on if you wanted to go that route, and even spells, right, if you are in your human form, so you've got that route as well. The last build we're going to call the Slayer, and this is a Bard Fighter combo. And this almost made it into my last 3 multi-class builds, as it does focus a lot on the synergies with dealing a lot of attacks per turn. But I felt like 3 was a better number for a video title, so I kept this one for this video, so sue me. But anyway, so what this is it's a Bard and Fighter combo, and the reason we're combining these is because the Fighter is just a great class to dip into for any multi-classing because of Action Surge, and we're leveraging that for this build, specifically for Slashing Flourish. So when you go into the subclass College of Swords, you get access to these like weapon arts for the Bard, and one of them is the Slashing Flourish, which can be used for melee or ranged attacks, and it will allow you to attack up to 2 enemies at once. Now, because you also get an extra attack in just a standard turn, this will allow you to attack 4 times essentially, right? Because you can attack 2 enemies at once, and then with that extra attack, you can do that again, so that's 4 times. Now, you combo that with Action Surge from Fighter, and that makes it 8 attacks in that one turn. Now, what's really great about this build is it's so versatile, as it's both a melee and a ranged build, and because we are going the College of Swords, you get to pick a fighting style, which we're obviously going dueling here, which will then allow you to add 2 extra damage to any of those attacks we're using with, say, a rapier or those sort of weapons. And then on top of that, because we're going fighter, you get access to another fighting style, which you can then go archery, so which will then add 2 extra damage to all of your ranged attacks. So you've got a bow that deals extra damage, you've got a sword that deals extra damage, you can then attack 8 times in the one turn with all of that extra damage stacking on top of each other. So it's just another like really great combo to combine together to deal heaps of damage. So we're picking out 4 levels of the fighter here, and we're probably for the subclass we're going to go champion. I toyed around with potentially going like Eldritch Knight, because you get like the spell level, and then also you could grab some extra spells, but because they're using intelligence as a spell casting modifier, and we're not a intelligence based class like at all, it just didn't really seem that beneficial. So we ended up going champion, mainly because the champion subclass feat that will improve your critical hits, so you get that additional benefit, and because we're attacking so many times, you got a much higher percentage chance of rolling those critical hits, so you get the benefits from that as well. We're going 4 in fighter here to get that extra feat, and then same for Bard, we're going 8 to get that extra feat. And in the Bard line here, we are going obviously the College of Swords, and in terms of the spells you want to pick up, you can grab anything you like that really supplements this build, but we're mainly focusing on those martial attacks with this combo, but then you've got those backups to spells if you want to use them. Not overly much to say about feats here, really just grab the ability improvement. I'm actually making this build a strength build using the Titan String bow, as it's a fantastic bow to use, which I didn't mention before. So that obviously uses strength, so we are using strength here as this general build setup, but that's up to you. You can go dexterity, there's completely nothing wrong with that. Obviously you get more AC and you get the benefits from that. You could do something similar to this build with the Thief's Rogue's extra bonus action for attacking and like using 2 hand crossbows to like get that extra like offhand attack. Maybe there's something there that I might play around with in a different build. Also, I've just updated my membership program here on YouTube to include early access to practically every video. So if you like these sort of builds or any of the other content that I do on the channel, consider joining the membership. Costs you literally $1. You get early access to basically every video, plus access to the members only Discord, a bunch of other benefits as well. So if you like what I do here, please consider checking that out. But enough of that, onto the video. We'll start with the Necromancer. Now this is a even split between a Necromancer wizard and a Spore Druid. Now you'll probably start off as the Druid for the proficiencies that you do get from there, but essentially the way that this build comes together is you're going to use the necromancy mechanics from the wizard to summon undead thralls, as well as the necromancy mechanics from a Circle of Spore Druid with fungal infestation to summon zombies in that way. So essentially here you'll get like a little bit of an army going of undead minions that you'll be able to use in combat. So generally most turns you'll sort of tinker between animating dead to animate dead enemies. Obviously you have to kill them first, which can be challenging. Now one thing to point out here is that the hardest part of this build is that you have to kill the corpse in a very specific way so that it's still a quality corpse. You know, you don't want to waste those corpses, so you can actually then reanimate them. So you can't like burn them or blow them up, that sort of a thing. They have to be a nicely clean presented corpse for you then to animate the dead. Now you can get around this a little bit with the Spore Druid elements, because with the fungal infestation you can raise a minion with a reaction, so you can actually get an additional zombie in that way as well. This essentially allows you to animate dead and use fungal infestation in the same turn, as one as an action and one as a reaction. Now the reason that we're going Necromancy 6 and Spore Druid 6 is because at level 6 for the Spore Druid, that's where you get the fungal infestation, and then at level 6 for the Necromancy Wizard you get the undead thralls, so your summons are actually better, they have additional hit points, and you get to add your proficiency bonus to their damage. So they deal a little bit more damage, so they'll survive a bit longer than they would typically in the early game. So it's a good balance there to get both of the benefits from both of these like necromancy themed classes. There is also plenty of gear here that will benefit from this build, right? The Circle of Bones headpiece will give you undead ward, so that allied undead within 6 meters are resistant to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage. It also gives you access to animate dead, which you already have anyway. You can use the armor of the Spore Keeper as well, which is like specifically for this like Spore Druid setup. It gives you access to a couple of different things for your spores with the spore stack, so you can like add different effects to them in that way. And there's a couple of different things you can do here in terms of weapon, right? You could just use a quarterstaff as a typical sort of Druid wizard would, but there is also a rapier called the Jeweler's Prerogative, which is, you know, it's a fine enough weapon. You're not really going to be attacking that much with this build, like just with your weapon. And by equipping this weapon, you get access to an additional reaction per turn. So the benefit there is, because as a Spore Druid, when you are actually spreading those spores, that is actually a reaction, the Halo of Spores attack, right? Now, if you wanted to use Halo of Spores and the fungal infestation in the same turn, you need 2 reactions in order to do this, and this rapier gives you 2 reactions. Now in this footage here you can see I'm not actually proficient with the rapiers, but that doesn't necessarily matter. You can actually pick up a feat here, which I actually did before recording the combat footage, that'll give you access to the proficiency for the rapier. So you can do that if you wanted to go that route, get the 2 reactions, and you can attack with an action or something like that, and then you've got the 2 reactions to use these Spore Druid specific reactions, so you've got benefits from there. But this is a fun build that is hard to really see success in early game. It really is a late game build, and it's also definitely a hard build to actually get going, because you need the dead, you need dead people, right? Like there's no better way to put it. You need to kill people with your other party members so you can reanimate them to actually see success with this build. So thanks to Beardmaster for this comment on the original video that you can stack corpses in your camp stash, or just pick them up in general and then take them to your camp and drop them, and then as the Necromancer you can animate them, which, you know, this is definitely a good thing that you can do. But he also mentions that children are practical because you can carry them as they don't weigh much. Maybe not the decision I would go with, but hey, it works. Takes a bit to get going, but it is definitely a fun build to put together. Next, we have a opposite sort of build, right? We talked about a very evil necromancy build. This is a pure healer, cleric, divination, wizard combo. Now, this is basically an active party version of my camp caster concept that I've talked about in a couple of videos, where you've got a caster that you have at your camp that'll have these like permanent buffs that every like day you can just return and use them to like buff your party, right? And I wanted wanted to do like an active version of this? What if you just wanted to have like a pure healer that comes with your party? And this is the best setup that you can do in my opinion. So essentially how this works is you will be a life cleric level 10 and a 2 divination wizard. Now the main thing here is during combat you're going to use your actions and bonus actions essentially to heal, and because of the life cleric class features you get, you do a really high amount of healing numbers with these different healing effects. We are comboing this with level 2 for the divination wizard for one specific reason, which is the portent die. Now twice per day you can change the roll, whether that be an attack roll or saving throw, of anything around you to be a number from that portent die. So you can use this to make enemies miss their attack roll, so protecting your allies. You can use this on your allies to make them pass saving throws. It's really beneficial, and it's a good way to use your reaction as this sort of like pure healer setup to avoid damage in that way. Now this build itself really is just simply about healing and buffing allies, you know, with things like Bane and Bless, as well as summoning support with your cleric, because you can use things like the spiritual weapons or the guardians of faith. If you don't actually need to do any healing, then you can still be beneficial in that combat encounter with the spiritual weapons to deal damage, or the guardian of faith, which will also deal damage and sort of pull attention away from your allies. Or you can like summon spirits around you. There's plenty of things you can do outside of just the simple like attacking, but the main thing that you'll do before any combat encounter, like literally every day, is you'll cast Long Strider on all of your allies for that free movement buff. Now this is a ritual spell, so it doesn't consume those spell slots, and then Aid for that free HP. You probably want to upcast Aid, but you get that extra free HP as well. So the higher that you cast Aid, the more like hit points you get for the rest of that day for them. So it'll give your allies that initial buff to their HP, then you can heal it back with those massive healing numbers that you can do with all of the AoE healing spells you can learn with the life cleric, plus the class feature benefits you get from that as well. So there's a lot of fun with this build too, and it definitely combos perfectly with like a tanky character or those like high damage impact characters as well, that say you don't really want to take a lot of damage. And it doesn't fit with this 3 combo of builds that we're talking about here, because they're all sort of all over the place. But if you're looking for, say, having some sort of a tank character, or you just want a character that protects your allies, then this pure healer setup is absolutely perfect for it, because of the different spells that you can learn to really protect your allies in that way. Our last build here is the Dueler. Now this is a rogue and bard hybrid that continues the theme for basically like my bard setups, I guess. Like if you think about the one we did in our last video, this is similar, but it's a different sort of concept. So this is a dexterity based bard or rogue, and we're using dual crossbows, using the hand crossbows here. Now the reason we're comboing this with a rogue is because as a level 3 thief rogue, when you pick the thief subclass, you get access to a bonus action. So you essentially have 2 bonus actions. By comboing this with the College of Swords bard, you can get access to 2 weapon fighting. So when you make an attack with your offhanded weapon, you can add your ability modifier to the damage of that weapon. So because we can then use offhanded attacks with the hand crossbow in our offhand, we can then add our ability modifier to that. You can also do the exact same thing with melee weapons, right? If you had 2 daggers or 2 short swords equipped, which we are also doing for this general setup. As a College of Swords bard as well, you get access to the flourishes, and the slashing flourish being the key here, right? Which allows you to attack up to 2 enemies at once. Now, as you level up the bard, because the bard's going to be your main class, you get that to level 8 and the rogue to level 4, so you get that extra feat, and then 8 for the bard, so you get the 2 feats that way, plus the extra attack. So essentially what happens here, right, is that in a standard turn, you can use Slashing Flourish to hit 2 targets, and then you can use that extra attack to use Slashing Flourish again to hit another 2 targets, which makes 4. Then you've still got 2 bonus actions left to make offhanded attacks that still have your ability modifier applied to them with your offhanded crossbow. What that gives you is in that one turn, you can essentially attack 6 times pretty simply. I'm also combining 2 hand crossbows here, the Hellfire hand crossbow and the Fire Stoker. Now this doesn't happen very often, but you can trigger this effect too, right? So with the Hellfire hand crossbow, if you attack while hiding or invisible, you can possibly inflict burning, and the Fire Stoker deals an additional piercing damage to burning targets. Now because we've got the rogue, we've got the cunning actions here to hide as well, so you can hide in combat and be able to trigger this effect, or say, you know, you can hide outside of combat and start from that initiative surprise effect as well. So you've got benefits to use these 2 hand crossbows that sort of really have nice synergy. So this is the general setup for this build, and you can go into the sharpshooter line to deal additional damage in that way for the feed as well. This is a fun build, and like bards are just fun in general because you got access to so many skills and proficiencies. Same with the rogue, so you'll be able to pass a lot of skill checks, and then you've also got the ability to attack multiple times per turn and do different things with the flourishes. And you've also got spells, right? Like you've got some spells that you can play around with. I would say with this build as well, just make sure that you're spreading your stats properly, because, you know, a bard would typically have a lot of charisma, but because we are a dexterity sort of martial focused bard, you want to make sure that dex is definitely a higher stat, still with a little bit of charisma there, so you can cast spells and get benefits from them if you want to go that route and do a little bit of that, but your main focus will be on that martial aspects of the kit. And if you wanted to, you could dip 2 levels into fighter to get like action surge there as well, so then technically you could like attack like another 4 times per turn if you wanted to get really crazy with this build, but I think that the flow of just having these 2 classes fits a little bit better. We're going to talk about the Throwzerker, which is a Berserker Barbarian comboed with a Thief Rogue. Now, there's a very specific reason why we're comboing these 2 together. As a Berserker Barbarian, which by the way, you're going to get to level 8, you will get the Frenzy instead of your typical Rage. And what you can do with Frenzy is use Enraged Throw, which essentially allows you to throw something as a bonus action, which is, you know, all well and good, that's fun, but what if you had a second bonus action, which is what we're getting from Thief? Now you want to get Thief to 4 as well, because we do want to get these feats, which is why we're going 8 Berserker Barb and 4 Thief Rogue, because you want to get the Tavern Brawler feat, so you can add your strength modifier twice when you are hitting something with a thrown item, and you also want to buff your strength as much as possible, right, with ability modifiers, because the more strength you have, then the more damage you'll do overall. And depending on the weapon you're going to be throwing, you could also grab the Polearm Master feat as well, so you can deal damage in that way as well. But essentially the main focus for this whole entire setup is literally you'll start combat, you've got 2 bonus actions initially, so you can Frenzy with one of those bonus actions, you've still got 1 left over for at least 1 Enraged Throw on that initial turn. The benefits with a Rage Throw is 1, because it throws the item that you're using, but also because it has a chance to make the target prone, which then gives your allies advantage on attacking them further. But on top of that, because you've actually got the throw action as well, you'll then be able to do that in the same turn. Now, as a Barbarian, you do get an extra attack, right? So in one turn, if you frenzied, say, the first turn, you can Enrage Throw twice with 2 bonus actions, and you can throw twice because you've got a throw and an extra attack. So that's 4 throws in one turn. Now, on top of that, if you combo this with the legendary trident that you can get at the very start of Act 3, this build is kind of ridiculous. I don't know how else to put it. So this trident that you can get at the start of Act 3 is legendary. Now, it comes with the Zephyr connection, so this weapon will return to your hand when thrown, so you don't have to worry about going to pick it up or any of that nonsense. However, when thrown, the weapon creates an explosion that deals 3 to 12 thunder damage and a 6-meter blast centered radius around it. You also get like additional like movement speed and all this other good stuff from this weapon. And then, you know, because we're buffing all of our throwing damage with all of these different ways, you can just add more gear that adds more damage, like the Rig of Flinging to add a 1d4 damage to throwing, the Caustic Band that adds 2 flat acid damage, and then the Helldust Gloves that also add 1d4 fire damage. So you're getting all of these additional damage on top of what you're already doing, plus this spear or trident makes it an AoE, and you can throw 4 times in one turn. So yeah, there's not much else to say really. Like, it's kind of nuts the amount of damage that you can do. And like, to be honest, I don't really like throwing builds because of, in a way, like this reason, they can get very OP and it feels a little bit like a meme in a way, but they are very fun if you enjoy this style of playthrough, just to be able to throw stuff all the time. I mean, you can even throw enemies and all sorts as well, but just throwing this trident will absolutely succeed in Act 3, like there's no question about it. The one thing to be aware of with this trident though is that you can actually hit your allies, because it will hit anything within that 6-meter like radius. So just like be careful not to kill your own allies, but if they get hit with it, it is their own fault. All right, moving on to the Eldritch tank. Now this goes perfectly with the Throwzerker because they avoid damage to such a high degree anyway, but the reason the Eldritch tank is a bit unique because this is a really tanky combo, one of the best tanky combos in the game, and we're using the Eldritch Knight because it's one of the only intelligent spellcasting classes, just like the Wizard is, so we're combining these two for that reason. Combining the Eldritch Knight Fighter and a Wizard together really help with one of the Wizard's weakest parts, which is their squishiness, as well as the Eldritch Knight's weakest element, which is a limited pool of spells. Now, what you can do with a certain section of spells is make them kind of immune to damage in a regard, and this is really one of the best tank options in the game. Even though you lose out on the 3rd extra attack from the fighter, it's still an exceptional tank setup if you just want to avoid damage and still dish out a fair amount in your own regard. Now, what really makes this sing is the shield spell. Now, this is a reaction spell, so you won't cast this yourself. So you want to make sure you're saving your reaction to do this. And essentially what happens with this is anytime that you are attacked, you can then avoid damage by this because you can increase your AC by 5, right? And because it's a reaction, you can see what they rolled. And then if it's not actually going to pass that check, you can just like don't react, or if it is, then you can react to avoid that damage. On top of that, the Abjuration School Wizard gives you access to Arcane Ward. So each time you cast an Abjuration spell, which is Shield by the way, and a couple of others, the intensity of the ward increases by the amount of the spell's level, up to a maximum of 2 times your wizard level. But each time you take damage, the ward blocks an amount of damage equal to its intensity, and the intensity decreases by 1. So essentially here, if something does get through your shield, like you're attacked too many times, you don't have reactions, whatever, as long as you've been casting Abjuration spells, you've got Arcane Ward, the amount of damage you'll take is less anyway. And then there are other ways to reduce your damage via certain gear and other buffs and debuffs like Mirror Image, so your AC is higher, that sort of stuff. And then at level 6, as the Abjuration Wizard as well, you get the Projected Ward, so you can then use it on your allies as well, not just yourself, so you can protect them in that way. So this is just a great like general tank setup, right? Now, you've got access to a bunch of spells, and I would really focus on the melee spells here, you know, like your Shocking Grasps and your Burning Hands, those sort of things, because this is really like a melee battle mage sort of a setup, but you've got that real tank potential. And you want to be careful here as well just about your overall armor class. Like when I put this build originally together, I put my armor class like as high as possible, right, with, you know, just maxing out using whatever shield and like heavy armor, etc., because we're a fighter, we've got access to that. But you won't get attacked as much because your armor class is going to be so high, so the enemy AI will often target other things, because it's like your armor class is like what, 24 or something, so like why attack you when they can attack, say, you know, the last build we're going to talk about, the Fire Demon, which has like a 16 armor class, right? So you want to sort of find that balance between your overall armor class so that things are actually attacking you, so you can trigger these effects, because you can take a hit as this Eldritch tank, right? You've also got access to Second Wind, so you can even heal yourself via the fighter ability as well, and you've got Action Surge to get the second action. Plenty of things that really come together with this kit, but it's a fantastic build if you wanted to play this sort of a setup. Really good for like a Lazil if you've got Lazil in your party or something like that. The last build here is the Fire Demon. This is mostly a Draconic Sorcerer, but we're dipping into an Evocation Wizard because of one specific thing. So the main setup here is you'll be a level 10 Draconic Sorcerer. You're going Draconic here because you get the additional benefits to one specific like damage type, and we're focusing on fire here. So at level 6 of the Draconic Sorcerer, you get access to the Elemental Affinity, so you get additional damage based on your Charisma modifier to every spell you cast of the same type as your Bloodline, which are obviously focusing on fire here. So you obviously want to be grabbing all of the fire spells, and probably around that level 6 mark, you want to have this dip into Evocation, and we only want 2 levels of Wizard Evocation so you can actually get that subclass, because the main focus here is just to get supple spells, because really this will then prevent you from hitting your allies with the massive fire explosions from, say, Firebolt, Wall of Fire, that sort of a thing, which just alleviates the biggest downfall of this sort of big explosion fire-based setup here, because you won't hit your allies, right? So you can then have classes like the Eldritch Tank and anything in melee range, and then drop these massive fire spells and avoid the effect of actually hitting them, which can get kind of frustrating. You want to make sure you grab the Elemental Adept feat for fire as well. So essentially what this will do, so your fire spells ignore resistance to fire, right? When you hit things that have resistance to it. If they are immune to fire, it won't actually remove that, but if they're resistant to it, it will remove that resistance. And it also prevents you from rolling a 1. So on top of all the additional benefits you get as a, you know, fire specific Draconic Fire Sorcerer, you then have that lower chance of rolling lower rounds of damage because you won't roll a 1. And you've got access to so many great fire spells in Baldurs Gate 3 too, right? Like you've got the Firebolt, you've got Burning Hands, you've got Scorching Ray, you've got Wall of Fire, and then you've got all of these fantastic spells that you can also then combine with the wizard spell Grease. Now when you put Grease on the ground, you can actually light this and create a little fire explosion, which then creates a hazard on the ground, so when enemies walk across it, they take fire damage. Now this is a wizard spell, so because we are dipping into wizard, we then get access to Grease in that way, and because we're a sorcerer, you can use Quickened Spell to cast both of these on the one turn. So you can cast Quickened Spell and then use Grease as a bonus action, action, put that grease on the ground, and then cast fire spell. Like, you don't even have to hit the ground specifically, you can hit a target because it will alight them and then alight that grease themselves. So you've got that benefit there as well as those additional effects for this build. The last thing I'll say about this build is make sure you have some sort of fire resistance. If you start as a tiefling, you get that just ingrained in you via your race, but if you go draconic sorcery, which we already have anyway, you will get fire resistance at level 6 because we have gone that fire setup. So just make sure that you either are getting that, you know, thinking about not standing in your own fire until you get to level 6 if you haven't gone a tiefling, or just, you know, running around like a maniac if you're a tiefling, because you can do that anyway. So firstly, we'll talk about the Raptor. This is a barbarian and rogue hybrid. Now, as some of you may know, in order to use stealth attack, you need advantage on the target. Now, you would typically get this as a rogue by hiding and attacking from, you know, stealth. It is a stealth attack, but you can get advantage in other ways, like the reckless attack from a barbarian, which will then allow you to add the stealth damage modifier without ever needing to be in stealth. So this gives you additional dice rolls on those attacks that you are attacking with reckless attack, which it's very often that you'll actually get critical hits with reckless attack as well on top of that, especially when you're combining with certain gear that allows you to lower the requirements of actually having to hit 20 to 19 or 18. What's also really unique about this build is that this isn't a strength-based barbarian. Now, technically, you could use this as a strength-based build, right? Because we are using finesse weapons. Finesse weapons don't mean you have to use dexterity. Essentially, it means you can use dexterity or strength. But I've chosen to go with dexterity for this build because I wanted to use rapiers as something a little different for the barbarian. It also combos perfectly, say, if you max out your dexterity and your constitution because of unarmored defense for the barbarian as well, which we aren't wearing any armor. So you can have like 18, 19 armor class at sort of the end of the game without, you know, even wearing any armor, having to worry about that. There's also this really great rapier late game that gives you an extra reaction that also gives additional necrotic damage, and it lowers the number that you need to in order to get a critical hit as well. Fits perfectly with this build that's focused on attacking with advantage to have a higher chance of getting critical hits, as well as applying stealth for that extra damage modifier. Now, as mentioned, we are using dexterity, so you can use any ranged weapon here as well if you wanted to go that route. But as you're building out this build, you probably want to start with a barbarian early game, as they're really good early game. You don't have to really do anything with them. At level 3, you'll pick up the Berserker, so then you've got Frenzy as your rage mechanic, which you can trigger. You've also then will have the Frenzied Strike, so you can use a bonus action to make an additional attack every turn. Plus, with the Rogue that we're comboing here, we're going level 3 Thief Rogue, which will give you that additional bonus action. So on top of that there, you can then use that bonus action in those turns to either trigger your rage and then attack with Frenzied Strike, or attack with the a bonus attack you get from using this rapier that we're talking about in this video as well. But on top of that, right, like you've got reckless attack to trigger all of these critical hits, as well as the stealth damage on top of that. Now, we're going 9 barbarian and 3 rogue here, because at 9 levels of barbarian, you get brutal crits, which will allow you to add an additional roll of dice on top of your normal critical hits, and then, you know, obviously stealth damage and all of your attacks on top of that, right? So we're really focusing on critical hits here for this build. There are different ways you could build this depending on what you're aiming for. Like, other than going 9 barbarian and 3 rogue, you could go like even out to say 8 barbarian and 4 rogue to get the extra feed if you wanted to, but you would lose the brutal critical hits as well. And then you could even go something like 7 barbarian and 5 rogue, which gives you the uncanny dodge from the rogue, which will lower the overall amount of damage you take. So you've got options here, right? But this is the general thesis of the build, is to use reckless attack to get the stealth attack modifier on top of attacks. We're using these finesse weapons in this way, and it's just a different way to play a barbarian. Next, we have the Colossal Guardian. Now, surprise, this one isn't actually a multi-class.
You agreed to stay away! I lied.
This is a funky build though, and it fits with the theme, and I've been itching to do one of these strength ranges because we've had a ton of comments about you can do these, and I know they're really good, and I wanted to actually do one in my own way eventually, so here we go. Now, I was originally going to actually make this a multi-class strength ranger with level 2 fighter to get action surge to have a second action, but you kind of don't really need it. Now, as a hunter ranger here at level 11, you'll get whirlwind attack, and that is really, really good. So dipping into anything other than like 1 level, you're kind of losing out on that attack. So it's a weird spot here. That's why I've decided to just go full strength ranger. So essentially the way this works is when you're picking your favored enemy as a ranger here, we're picking ranger knight. Now this gives you proficiency in heavy armor, which we're going to be wearing heaps because we're not going to have a high dexterity to increase with your overall armor class. And when you are picking your abilities here, you want to make sure that you have got your strength and constitution up as high as possible as your ability point modifiers compared to increasing your dex, which you still want a little bit of dex, right? But like you don't necessarily need it. It's only for your initiative in this sort of case. So as you do level up here at level 3, when you pick a subclass, we're picking the hunter, and you've got 2 options here. You can go the Colossal Slayer or Horde Breaker. Now Horde Breaker will give you an attack that will allow you to then attack 2 creatures with that same attack, right? And then after that you can use an extra attack and everything anyway. Now Colossal Slayer will add an additional damage die to enemies that are below their max health. Both of these options are fine. Now you can actually use the Horde Breaker attack with Whirlwind Strike on the same turn. Now at level 11 you gain Whirlwind Strike, which essentially what you do here is you will just like swing in a circle and attack anything that's in that like radius around you. Now because you can use Horde Breaker and Whirlwind Strike in the same turn, you can hit a ton of enemies, or you can go the Colossal Slayer route where once per turn your weapon attacks deal additional damage if the target is below its hit point maximum, and for the most part you're going to be hitting enemies that are below the hit point maximums more regularly than 2 enemies are going to be standing next to each other in those like perfect scenarios. So more consistent damage across the board, but both are really fine. It's entirely up to you. What I would mention as well is to grab the Titan String Bow to use your strength modifier for ranged attacks with your ranger, you know, if you do use that route as well. I'm also using a polearm or a spear in this footage here because you can get the feat the polearm master, so you can attack with the butt of that weapon as a bonus action. You can also make attacks of opportunity when enemies enter your radius as well, so you've got that freedom there too. And you can also use Hunter's Mark with this build as well, so you can add a 1d6 damage to every hit from your main target that you do trigger this with. It's really good early game, but it's not as good sort of late game because enemies have much more health than a 1d6 adds, but it's extra damage for the sake of your bonus action, so you know you may as well use it. Rangers generally suck early game. It's just sort of the way it goes. Now, there isn't much you can sort of do about it and just sort of survive until these things start to come together. Once you hit level 3 and the build sort of starts coming together and you get some better weapons and stuff, this will really excel. Like, it's a high defense build that also deals a ton of damage because of Horde Breaker or Colossal Slayer plus Whirlwind Strike, which is fantastic. So you've got a lot of flexibility in terms of your damage and using those polearms, but it will take a little while to get going. Like, Rangers are one of the hardest classes in the early games, in my opinion, to sort of get value out of, but just stick with it and you'll be fine. Last, we've got the Kung Fu Healer. Skadoosh. So this is the Monk Cleric build that I mentioned in my original multi-class guide as a potential for the Monk. I wanted to actually build this out. So the Monk has little synergy with most classes, considering your key points is directly tied to your Monk levels. Every time you dip into another class, you're losing out on potential key points that you can then use to like use all of your Monk attacks. So it's hard to recommend multi-classing heaps with the Monk unless you're like adding bonus actions or actions to sort of offset that. But what you can also do is, because the Monk has Wisdom as their spellcasting modifier and also for their unarmored defense, the Cleric also uses Wisdom for their spellcasting modifier. So there is some synergies here. Now, by combining a Life Cleric and a Monk in this instance with a Life Cleric, or really any Cleric, you can get Spirit Guardian. So nearby enemies take 3d8 Radiant or 3d8 Necrotic damage per turn, and the movement speed is half when they're around you. Now, Monks have great movement speed, so they can move around the battlefield fast, and this attack only works for things that are close to you. Now, as a Cleric with Spirit Guardians, this is a ton of damage. Like, even just going straight Cleric and using Spirit Guardians is heaps of damage. But using that, and then you've also still got bonus actions you can use in that same turn to use the Monk attacks, right? And then because I've gone the Life Cleric route to sort of focus a little bit more on healing, you can then grab those healing spells. You can actually heal enemies in that sort of allies, not enemies, in that same turn, and then use those bonus actions to attack on that same turn as well, which is something that happens a lot with casters, especially Clerics as well, that sometimes those bonus actions go unused. So combining it with the Monk so you can then attack with those unarmed strikes as well and use those key points, you've got the value there. Now, as a Monk here, I am going the 4 elements to use the Monk spells that you get access to. The only one you have to specifically grab, I would say, is Water Whip. It pulls enemies towards you, so you can pull them into the range of your Spirit Guardian, or just in terms of attacking that sort of a thing. The other ones are really up to you, like just grab the different elements that you feel is more valuable to the overall damage that you want to do. And in terms of the level break here, we're going 7 4 elements monk and 5 life cleric. We need that level 5 so that we can get access to spirit guardians. That's the specific reason I'm going that route. And then 7 monk because we want as much monk as possible so that we can actually get as many of those key points that we can actually use in combat. Now, if you don't like this healing route, you could go something like the monk way of shadow with the trickery cleric. Something like that is a different way to play a similar build, still with access to spirit guardians, but you know, the shadow and the trickery cleric, they do have a lot of synergies there as well. So you've got different ways you can play this build, but it's just a fun build that I wanted to actually put together because I did sort of briefly mention it in that video as something I've been tinkering with, but it gives you a lot of flexibility, right? The monks are often just so focused on using those unarmed strike and key points, and then you can use some of those cleric spells to offset that to give you different flexibility in combat, and then vice versa. As a cleric, you've got access to the monk bonus actions that you can then use in those same turns to stun enemies or just attack enemies with flurry of blows, that sort of stuff. Different combinations you can combine with this sort of melee focused cleric and monk. So let me know your thoughts on these builds in the comments, guys. I'm really interested to know what you think about these unique builds. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.